an unidentified flying object.
Researcher on a mission with Dr. J.N. Elias.
We have an unidentified flying object.
Welcome back to another episode of Dr. J Radio Live. Of course, I am your host, Dr. J. And as always, we have a fabulous show for you today. And today's guest is also going to appear at Contact in the Desert. Speaking of which, the final three winners will be announced at the top of the hour. Those are winners number 23, 22, 23, and 24. That's right. 24 listeners have won tickets over the last couple months, and I know several of you are going, and you will have a blast. Before we introduce our all-star guest, let's talk about some UFO news real quickly. First, I really like this one. A UFO was spotted at a PGA tournament yesterday, and there are photographs of it. I thought that was really fantastic. Doesn't everyone always say what we need is a giant ship to show up over the Super Bowl or something? Well, came over a PGA tournament. It's climbing the ladder. That's a good thing. Here's another thing. This is very reminiscent of what happened with Ronald Reagan when he was governor of California. Former Obama pilot who saw UFO talks to Fox News. This is very good for us. Finally, you have another insider who is unimpeachable, very credible, and is actually talking to mainstream media about what he saw. On the same lines of that, this is great too. Senior U.S. Senator reports seeing two UFOs that were covered up. That senator was Senator Richard Russell, and him and two aides saw two UFOs in 1955 when on a Soviet information recon mission. I thought that was really fantastic. And remember, these trumpet sounds that everyone's been hearing around the world, I think have been truly fascinating because they're different and they appear everywhere. Jaime Maussan had an amazing video which showed them in Los Angeles. I've seen them in Northern California, China, Ukraine, just about everywhere. Nothing is immune for these crazy, weird sounds that seem to originate from the sky. This report came straight out of the Daily Mirror in the UK, and it says UFOs or sounds from God. That's exactly what people have been saying. The people on the religion aspect think that it's the second coming. The Jesuits believe it is the first coming. And of course, other people think this leads us to disclosure. Speaking of disclosure, I will be on the disclosure panel with today's guest, along with several people who you've heard recently. This past Thursday, you heard former Congressman Merrill Cook, along with Stephen Bassett. Congressman Cook has just been added to the lineup and will be on the disclosure panel as well. Stephen Bassett, Linda Moulton Howe, Richard Dolan, and several others who appeared at the citizen hearing will be there. So many topics we'll be discussing today with our all-star guest, and I want to see if he is back yet. Mr. Sheehan, are you available? Not quite yet. So let's talk about some more of the UFO news. What I wanted to hear, actually, before we go back to some more UFO news, I want to ask each and every one of you who want a ticket to Contact in the Desert to find me. Find me there during the two special events that I'll be on. I'll be doing the disclosure panel, which is Saturday night, 7:30 to 9:30 in the main auditorium. And then I don't want to give this special promo until they get a chance to do it, which should be available today. But something super special is happening on that Sunday, which is not to be missed. And I'm sure all of you here are very well aware of that. For those of you who've been sending me UFO news, I really appreciate all the updates. And after Contact in the Desert, I would love to get your feedback. Either if you have won a ticket for me or you haven't, regardless, I would love to get the feedback. Again, this is still in the news. 2 weeks ago today was Jaime Maussan's Be Witness event showcasing the Roswell slides. A lot of people have taken slack. Just as you know, if you were listening that very same night, we had Nick Redfern on, and we thought that the writing on the placard on the glass would be the unveiling. And sure enough, as you heard the last several shows, it seems to have been that. Some sites claim that the same technology used to decipher the writing was very different than what actually was the same technology was used for over 2 years to decipher it yet they couldn't decipher it. But once it hit the mainstream, people were able to decipher it in minutes. I thought that was really interesting. But again, you cannot deny what it says. There's a few words, and when the translation is out, you see X's in place of the words they can't decipher. But it says something along the lines of mummy of Native American 2-year-old boy who died in 1898 on loan from the Smithsonian Museum. And this was in, of course, San Francisco. I don't know the name of the museum there. And in some of those photographs that were found in that big box of slides included Mrs. Eisenhower, Dwight D. Eisenhower's wife. And I thought that was really fantastic. But it turns out that in her golden years, she happened to be great friends with the lady who was taking the pictures and who also appears next to the Roswell slide in the back of it as if she's posing with it. So that solves the mystery there with respect to why Eisenhower had anything to do with it. Well, I'm going to start telling you about today's show. I guess I will spit out the guest who's going to be joining us here very shortly, and that is the one and only Daniel Sheehan. And I got to say, he's been a true hero for me because when I was in law school, when I just started typical 1L blues, I happened to be watching, I don't know what channel it was. It definitely wasn't National Geographic. It was something along the lines of Discovery or Travel. And there was an episode, a UFO documentary. And this was still in the era where there was debunkers talking. For every time you would have someone talking about UFOs, you would have someone debunking it. Well, that's the first time I got a glimpse of Mr. Sheehan. And he was talking about a lawsuit, a case that he was involved in where he was actually able to view the Roswell slides. And a light bulb went off in my head. I said, wow, there's a lawyer that's actually doing good for the extraterrestrial phenomena. And that gave me a big hope in my mind that I knew there's a way to follow my passion and still work within the confines of what I've been educated with. So, Mr. Sheehan, before you come on, I want to thank you for the inspiration. And then, of course, I continued to do my research on him. And I'm sure you all remember, if you were paying attention to ufology back then, with John Mack. Once he started to listen to these people who had purported contact with extraterrestrials, abductees as you know them, he was getting a lot of BS, is I guess the lack of a better word, from Harvard. And yet he was a tenured professor at the School of Medicine. I mean, that is really very highly serious to be in such in such academics, and yet to start getting negative feedback from your peers. That really blew my mind because he realized that there's all these people that have no symptoms of psychosis, that they are truly going through something that is traumatizing. What they're seeing appears to be real to them, and this transcends every single person, meaning males, females, 2-year-olds to 80-year-olds, rich, poor, gay, straight, black, white, you name it. There was no group excluded from the alien abduction phenomenon, and that's what prompted him to start looking into it more. But when he did, that's what actually blew me away of how negative the feedback he was getting. With that being said, we just got disconnected from our guest, so everybody hang tight. You're going to hear some brief ringing. Actually, nope. Here he is, Mr. Sheehan.
Oh, there he is.
Yes, we are back with our
we're standing by.
Excellent. We are back with the one and only superstar guest I was telling you, who was a big inspiration to me when I was in law school, and that is Daniel Sheehan. Mr. Sheehan, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. J. I'm glad to be here.
It's honestly a true pleasure to speak to you, especially when I get to meet you next week. We're both going to be on the disclosure panel. I don't know how I ended up there, aside from bringing Congressman Cook to the event, but I'm going to be on there with you. And I think it's everybody's responsibility to take disclosure in their hands. I mean, you can't just sit passively by and let it happen. But before you came on, I was talking about when you first hit radar for me, and that was back when I was in 1L, and I was watching a UFO documentary, and boom, up pops you within doing an interview, and I realized, wow, there's an attorney who's helping the ufology, and you gave me the direction to where I am now. But then, of course, I did my research and found that John Mack and everything else after that, of Gary McKinnon, which is a big topic for me. But I want to take you back to that case that I didn't catch all of, but it essentially gave you an opportunity to view classified pictures of the Roswell crash. And I was wondering if you could give us the background of that story and how you were able to view them.
Okay, well, it wasn't the photographs of the Roswell crash, but let me tell you what happened. What happened is back in 1976, in November of 1976, when President Jimmy Carter was elected, I was in Washington, D.C. I was the chief counsel for the Jesuit National Headquarters, and I was contacted. Actually, I was having dinner with the secretary of the National Science Foundation, Rosie Chalk, and we were talking about the issue about extraterrestrial intelligence. She asked me about it, and I was talking with her about it, and she said, "Oh, you know, a good friend of mine, Marcia Smith, has just been. She is the director of the Science and Technology Division of the Congressional Research Service." And she has just been contacted by the Science and Technology Committee of the House of Representatives. And it turns out that when President Carter was elected on November 4th of 1976, immediately in December, before he was sworn in January of 1977, he contacted the head of the Central Intelligence Agency, George Bush Sr., who was the director of the Central Intelligence Agency at the time under President Ford. And President-elect Carter asked George Bush, as the director of the Central Intelligence Agency, to provide to him, as the president-elect, all of the files on UFO sightings in the issue of extraterrestrial intelligence. And George H.W. Bush declined to give it to him, saying, look, he wanted first to discuss the fact that George Bush wanted to remain as the CIA director for President Carter. He wanted to be left on as the director of Central Intelligence, whether it was a Republican or Democratic administration, much like J. Edgar Hoover had remained as the head of the FBI for like 200 years. You know, from the time he came on board through one president after another, through Truman and Eisenhower and Kennedy and LBJ, et cetera. And President Carter said, no, you know, I've got my own person in mind to be the director of the Central Intelligence Agency, and I want you to give me the information since I'm the new elected president. And George Bush refused to give it to him. He said that if you want to get any of that information, you're going to have to go to the Science and Technology Committee of the House of Representatives and ask them to contact the Congressional Research Service in their Science and Technology Division and have them make applications to declassify it if you're going to get to see it, because you have no need to know. And President Carter, well, being taken aback by the whole thing, went ahead and contacted the Science and Technology Committee of the House of Representatives. They, in turn, pursuant to his request, contacted the Science and Technology Division of the Congressional Research Service, and Marcia Smith, as the director, had been asked to compile 2 classified reports for the president-elect. One was on the question of what the probabilities were that there were one or more highly intelligent, highly technologically developed, intelligent species other than our human species in the universe. And the second question was, to what degree of probability did they believe that any one or more of the reported UFO sightings was in fact a craft from an extraterrestrial civilization visiting our planet? And so she had begun that study, and she had spoken with Rosie Chalk, who was the secretary of the National Science Foundation, or National Academy of Science. That's what it was, the National Academy of Science. And it told her that she had this assignment to seek assistance from Rosie Chalk. And so Rosie Chalk was talking with me about it. and she said, would you be willing to participate in this special study that the president wants done? And I said, sure, have Marcia call me. And so Marcia Smith called, and I went to lunch with her, and she asked me if I would, as general counsel for the Jesuit National Headquarters in Washington, whether I would contact the Vatican Library in Rome, the head of which was a Jesuit, and see if, in fact, I could get access to the classified sections of the Vatican Library to see whether or not they contained any information on either of these two questions, whether extraterrestrial intelligence lived in the universe, and whether or not any of the UFO sightings were deemed by the Vatican to be extraterrestrial vehicles. So I checked with my superior, Father William J. Davis, at the Jesuit National Headquarters, and he checked with his superior, Father Terry Shea, and we were given permission by our board of directors, the assistant provincials for social ministry in the United States, the 10 of them, agreed to have me do this. So I agreed with Marcia Smith to contact the head of the Vatican Library, and I sent him a formal letter asking if we could get access to those sections of the Vatican Library. And he wrote me a letter back and said no. And so I was rather taken aback, and so I sent him a second letter saying, look, you must have misunderstood what I was asking for and understand who we are. This is the United States Jesuit Headquarters. We constitute the headquarters for 10 of the provinces of the world here in the United States, and the President of the United States has asked for this information, and we've agreed to cooperate in getting it for him, and we would like to have access to the classified sections of the Vatican Library to see what the information is. And they sent back a letter again and said, no, you can't have it. So I contacted Marcia and apologized to her for my inability to get it, and we were all disappointed. But that was that at that point. And then a month or two into this study that we were doing, Marcia contacted me, and she said, look, the United States House of Representatives has cut off, has denied half of the budget for the next fiscal year to the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, to the SETI program, to the Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory in Pasadena, California. And they believe that they're not allowed to lobby because they're government employees, and they think that the Hatch Act, a federal piece of legislation that prohibits government employees from lobbying, they think the Hatch Act prohibits them from lobbying, and they want to know whether or not you would be willing, as the legal counsel for the Jesuit National Headquarters, the largest order in the Catholic Church, and the Catholic Church being the largest single denomination, a Christian denomination in Western civilization, whether you would be willing to go to the Congress and ask the Congress people to reinsert that half of the budget back to the SETI program. So I again checked with my superior, Father William J. Davis, and went on up the chain. And the Jesuit assistant provincials for social ministry agreed that that was a worthy project. So I went with Rusty Schwab and the two or three other of the former astronauts. We went around together to the key congressmen and asked them to reinstate the other half of the budget for SETI. And they did. They agreed to do it. So they put it back in. And all of the scientists at SETI were totally happy and jumping up and down, or at least as much as scientists do. And so they ended up contacting Marcia Smith and expressing their great gratitude for my having done this. And they invited me to come to the SETI program, to JPL at Pasadena, to fly me out there and to do a 3-hour closed-door seminar to the top 50 scientists at SETI on the theological implications of contact with an extraterrestrial civilization. And so I, again, got permission to do that through the Jesuit headquarters. And I went to Marcia Smith and I said, Marcia, look, in preparation for this closed-door seminar to the top 50 scientists at SETI, I'd like to, through this study that we're doing here, I'd like to have you submit a request to the Air Force if I could get access to the classified portions of Project Blue Book, the U.S. Air Force study that was done back in the 50s of the UFO phenomenon. And she expressed some concern. She didn't think that they'd be willing to do that. I mean, because it was, because they in fact had not even acknowledged that there were major classified portions of that. They had professed to have reviewed all of the materials and that had said that, as far as they could tell, there was nothing that indicated that there was any extraterrestrial contact through any of these things. They passed them all off as swamp gas or people's indigestion after dinner, I guess.
And Venus.
That's right, swamp gas and Venus rising. And so she actually, I said, well, let's try it, that we're in this kind of unique position. The president has asked for this. You're the head of the Science and Technology Division. The congressional committee has asked for this. So she went ahead and she submitted the request. And much to her surprise, a couple of weeks later, she gets this communication back saying, yes, they've agreed to make this available to me in my capacity as a special consultant to the special investigations being done by the Science and Technology Division of the Congressional Research Service for the president. So she told me that I was to go to the new wing of the Library of Congress. It was a brand new building that had just been completed. I think it's called the Madison wing or the Jefferson wing or something, but it was brand new at the time. And I was to go there on the following Saturday morning, bring 2 forms of identification with me with photos. And so I went there Saturday, all dressed up in my suit and my little briefcase and looking very lawyer-like, and with my passport and my Washington, D.C. driver's license and birth certificate. And anyway, so I went there and I look around and I find these 2 guys, these 2 suits, standing out front of one of the doors of this brand new building with nobody in it. It was completely unoccupied. It had just barely been finished, completion. And I walked up to them, and they asked who I was, and I told them who I was, and they said, okay, yes, we're expecting you to show me your ID. So I showed them all my different forms of ID, and so they showed me in. So I went in. I went into the first floor of this building, and they escorted me in. They said I was to go down the hall, and I would find an elevator down there on the left, and I was to go down to the basement floor. So I walk all the way down this big long hall, and I press the elevator button, and I go down to the basement, and I get out. And as I was going down in the basement, it just struck me that I should open up my briefcase and take out a yellow pad so I could keep it and have a pen with me in my suit pocket. So I put the yellow pad under my arm, and then I close the briefcase back up, and I get out of the elevator, and I walk down the hall further. I see this door way down the hall on the left, and there are these 2 suits down there, these 2 security guys. They were, after a while you get to know these guys, and they weren't. It wasn't Secret Service, and it wasn't CIA. They looked almost like military security. I ended up assuming that they were probably OSI guys that were Office of Special Investigation or something for U.S. Air Force. But I go down the hall, and I walked up, and one of the guys said, "Let me see your ID." And so I showed him my passport and my birth certificate and my driver's license and stuff. And they said, "Okay, you have to leave your briefcase here, outside of the room. You're not allowed to take any notes or anything." So I just left the yellow pad under my arm, never said a word, and just kind of walked in. I gave him my briefcase, and I walked into the room, and there was this room that must have been, I don't know, maybe 12 feet wide by 6 or 8 feet deep. It was like a little office, and there were like 3 tables, folding tables, that were standing there, and they two of them had stacks of these like shoebox size boxes, kind of light beige green, like light greenish beige color, and on the third table there was actually a there's 15 things I'm going to tell you about that I should have kicked myself in the butt later after not having done. But one of them was a little film projector, a little 8mm like film projector. It was sitting there. There's no reels on it or anything, but it was just sitting there. And so I went over and I laid the little yellow pad down on a desk, and I started looking around in these boxes, and they were these little film canisters in there. There were probably about maybe 20 of them or 30 of them in each box, and it turns out they were little microfiche, like microfilm things, not microfilm but microfiche. And there was a little microfiche machine, one of these little tinny things with a little hand crank on the side. A lot of you guys, younger guys, probably don't even remember those things.
I absolutely remember. Yeah.
Okay, there you go. Yeah. So there they were. So I sit down, I start opening up these boxes, and I take out one little canister after another, and I string them in that little thing, and I start cranking the little thing, and it's documents. And I'm looking at these documents, and I start to read these documents. They're Air Force internal documents. And I'm going, oh, gee, I said, this is going to take me forever. And I kept looking through them. And they were like a lot of the documents that eventually turned up, in Richard Dolan's, 2 volumes, his UFOs and National Security State. They were internal Air Force documents that were all classified. And I was looking through these things. I was saying, wow, they're interesting. It's going to take a heck of a long time to read these things. I don't know how much time I'm even going to get here. And so I started looking through one little canister of microfiche after looking for photographs. And finally, I don't know, I must have been 6, 8, 10 of these little things, of these canisters into this process, when all of a sudden I turn the little crank, and here's a photograph of a UFO. And this is definitely not the Roswell event, because it was winter time. It was snow. There was snow on the ground in the photograph, and a UFO must have been about maybe 100 feet across, with the classic dome on the top of it. It had hit into this field, and it had plowed this trench all the way through this field, and maybe 30 yards or so, and then it was stuck in the side of the bank. It was a big dirt embankment that was all covered with snow, but it was sticking in the side of this embankment. It was sticking up at about a 40-degree angle, 45-degree angle into the snowbank, right? But I could tell that it was a dirt embankment just covered with snow. And there were all these Air Force guys in the photograph all around it, and they were in these parkas. And so I cranked the little handle on the side of the microfiche machine, and there were 2, 3, 4, 5 photographs from different angles of this craft that had obviously hit into this field, and different angles of the Air Force personnel that were all around looking at this thing. And in one of them, one of the Air Force personnel in one of these big parkas actually had a camera, a film, a movie camera, and it was like one of those kind that had the 2 great big rolls on the top of the movie camera. So this is must be 1940s or something, the date of it. But the bottom line is, I was looking at these pictures, and I was trying to see whether or not I could focus in on the Air Force guys, because I was trying to see if I could read a name tag, a name that they're usually sewn into their jacket, their parkas, right? Mm-hmm. And so I was trying to see if I could read any names so I could copy down the names of these guys and get a hold of them and find out what this was all about, right? Because there didn't seem to be any documents that were leading into where those photos were or afterwards. But that finally I realized when I was trying to I was trying to magnify this picture so I could get a look at the name tags, and then I realized that I could see that there was some kind of symbols that were along the bottom of the dome of this UFO, and I went, "Wow, holy mackerel! Look at this, man!" I said, and so what I did is I looked around to make sure they weren't looking at me or anything, because they were still outside the room, and I took the yellow pad and I slipped it under the viewer in the microfiche machine, and I focused the picture so that it was the exact same size as the inside back cardboard back of the yellow pad. And so but I could see these symbols, and then what I did is I took out my pen and I traced exactly what the symbols were around the base of the dome of this UFO. And then I closed the yellow pad back up and slipped it off to hit it behind the little microfiche machine, and then I put the microfiche little film back in the canister, and I put it back in the box, and I put the boxes back up, and I said, "Wow!" I said, "I better get out of here before they catch me having done this." And so, and here's these other boxes are all sitting there, and here's this projector sitting over there, and I hadn't run into any kind of films yet. I hadn't seen any films there, so it was stupid, is what it was. And so I just said, "But I better get out of here, but so I don't get in trouble." And so I took I put all the stuff away, and I put the yellow pad under my arm, and I walked out the door where these two suits were. And I walk out. And they were kind of startled to see me come out of there, I guess that quickly. And so it took them a little bit by surprise. And so I walked over and picked up my briefcase and started walking away. And I got, 8 or 10 steps past them, and finally they kind of gathered their wits. And one of the guys said, "Wait a second, hold it there, hold it." And I stopped. He says, "What's that you got there?" And I said, "Oh, this is my briefcase. I just picked my briefcase up." And he said, No, I mean under your arm there. What is that you got there?" And I said, "Oh, that's just a yellow pad." And he walked over to me kind of, this little swaggery, he comes swaggering over to me, and he reaches out and he snatches the yellow pad out from under my arm, and he riffles through the pages of the yellow pad, and of course there's nothing on it. And so he grumps and hands it back to me. And so I put it back under my arm, and then I kind of whistle on down the hallway. And I go down the hall, I get back in the elevator and just keep holding my breath, and I'm going to get out of there. And I go upstairs, and I go out through the upstairs and walk out of the place. And so on Monday morning, I come into my office, Jesuit National Headquarters at 1717 Mass Ave, just off DuPont Circle where my office was. And I walk in, and I go in to see Father Davis, Father William J. Davis, who's my superior, right? And I show him the yellow pad, and I show him the symbols on this thing, and I tell him exactly what I had seen. And he gives me this kind of strange look, and he reaches down, and he slides open the dresser, the drawer in his desk. He takes out this little envelope, and he undoes the clasp on it, and he hands to me this envelope that's got a letter from his sister, Dodie, who lives up in Washington State, and her husband is a air traffic controller at the Seattle Washington Airport. And in this thing is a letter from her and a photograph that she had sent to her brother as a Jesuit priest. And it turns out that it was a photograph taken by her husband's, one of his very best friends, who's a commercial airline pilot. And he had taken this photograph of a UFO out of the window of his commercial airliner and didn't know what to do with it. And he was afraid to report it to anybody. So he took it to his best friend, who was the air traffic controller at the Seattle airport, and gave it to him and said, "Okay, now I've done my job. There it is. You've got it." And her husband was afraid to report it to anybody. So he took it and showed it to her and asked her to take it and give it to her brother because he was a priest. And so she had sent the thing to Father Davis. And so he gave me the little file, right? So I put the yellow pad into the little envelope with the picture, and then Father Davis and I got permission from the assistant provincials for social ministry of the 10 provinces of the Jesuit order to propose to the Washington Interreligious Staff Council, which was this coalition of the top 54 major religious denominations in the United States, to propose to them, based on what I had found out, I proposed that we establish a task force, an interreligious task force, to start to address the issue of what the theological implications were of there being another highly intelligent, highly technologically developed species in our universe other than our human family. And I introduced it at a meeting, and I remember Dr. Judy Stone, who was the chair of the thing, just kind of stared at me, and then she said to everybody else, "Well, are there any other ideas? Anybody else have anything else they'd like to recommend?" And they just ignored it, and like nobody wanted to do anything about it. And so it was that was my first experience with all of this, and that was in 1977. And I had all of those documents that were in my files for the Jesuits. They're in my official files. But I thought that I had taken those with me when I left Washington, D.C. in 1992, and I just as part of my regular files. But I think that they're part of them that got wet. Actually, that they, I had them with me, some of the files in Riverside, California, and there was a big flood, and it flooded out a whole bunch of this storage facility we had, and part of the Jesuit files got wrecked, and they threw them out.
Ouch.
And I was just praying that it wasn't part of those things. But we've looked and looked and looked around now, because you can imagine people said, "Oh, get me a copy of that thing and show me." Now I know what they looked like. And I don't remember the exact order that they were in sequentially on the little bottom of the dome, but I know exactly what they looked like. They were like little. They were like a combination of little short straight lines off at an angle, like from either upper right to lower left, one or two lines, and then they had either above the line or below the line, one or two dots or little kind of half moon shaped things, and that they were, and then the other ones were like lines that went from upper left to lower left, and they had the same thing, little dots or little horseshoe kind of half moon shaped things above the lines or below the lines, but you could tell that they were clearly some kind of letters of some sort. But they certainly weren't anything that I'd ever seen. They weren't like hieroglyphics. They weren't any kind of symbols that I've ever seen anywhere else. But that's what they looked like.
There's two other cases that I know where symbols were drawn. One being, of course, the Roswell crash, Jesse Marcel Jr., and then 1980 Peniston in the Rendlesham. Did any of the symbols that they drew look similar to what you?
Nope, they were not. They were not. They were different. They were different. Both sets of those were different than the ones that I saw.
Which obviously goes to show that there's multiple civilizations using different forms of writing.
Or all from one civilization, they came from different countries.
Yeah, there you go. That's
like Russia. One's in Russia. They're Russian and they're English, or whatever that is. I don't know. One of the things is that as a professional investigator and professional attorney that's done dozens and dozens of major cases, ranging from the Pentagon Papers case to the Silkwood case to Iran-Contra and all the other major litigations I've done, is I don't get paid to speculate about things. If people want something investigated, there are ways to do it, but it has to be done responsibly. There has to be adequate financing, not for me because I do everything for free, but you have to hire professional investigators, experts, that can do scientific analysis and things for you. And so that the real question is whether or not in this particular very important field, there are people who are as well off as any other type of foundation people who are really interested ultimately in having a full-scale literally professional investigation of these things done. And the problem is that 99% of everybody who's involved in this whole field are amateurs, which is okay. I mean, because at least they're not bought off or by any institutions or anything. But people are amateurs for the most part, and there's though they have an investigation like they did the Congressional Research Service. It was like they're professionals and they did research, but they still didn't do any de novo field investigation. And even when you hear about Project Blue Book, et cetera, when you find out about it, it turns out that there's 2 or 3 guys that are Office of Special Investigations or something like that. They're assigned to basically gather up the data and then suppress it.
Yes.
And to conceal it, and to intimidate people who are perfectly willing to testify. And that's why we did the thing that with Dr. Stephen Greer in 2001. We did the Disclosure Project, and that we actually I was actually legal counsel to the Disclosure Project, and vetted the 20 witnesses that we were going to present, to the people from Congress, and that we had the full bird colonels, so we had the chief investigator for the FAA, the Federal Aviation Agency. We had ranking naval officers and pilots and commercial pilots. We had really straight government people, and I was responsible for vetting those witnesses.
Prior to the 1977 incident, when you were asked to reach out to the Vatican and see their library, and before you asked the House of Representatives to reinitiate the funding for SETI, did you have an interest at all in this topic, or was it that's just where it took you?
Oh, well, no. Anybody would. I mean, anybody with an IQ above room temperature, has to be extraordinarily fascinated by this whole subject. I remember back in 1965 reading about Betty and Barney Hill. That's an extremely persuasive case, that whole famous incident at Exeter. I'd read that, and I read all kinds of stuff, because I remember back from the time that I was like 7 years old. I remember sitting out in the yard at night when it would be getting dark and watching the stars come out, and learning to distinguish the difference between a star and a planet. And I was originally, when I was really little, interested in being an astronomer. I said, wow, this is the most interesting thing. Then I realized you had to do all that math and geometry and all that stuff, and I wasn't particularly big on all that. And so then I decided I was going to be an astronaut. And in fact, that's how the conversation came up with Rosie Chalk. I was sitting having dinner with Rosie Chalk. I told you, the secretary for the National Academy of Science, and she was saying, "Gee, it's really remarkable, all of these cases that you've been involved in. You did the Pentagon Papers case with the New York Times. You did the United States Supreme Court case that established the right of journalists to protect their confidential news sources. You did the United States Supreme Court case that established the right of unmarried people to have access to birth control. You've done all these the Karen Soakwood case, and all these big cases." And she said, "You must have always wanted to be a lawyer. You must have been a natural-born lawyer." And I said, "No, actually, I wanted to be an astronaut," I told her. And, except that the United States Senator, Jacob Javits, gave the appointment to the son of one of his major financial contributors. I said, so I was offended. And then the Congressman, Carlton King, gave the appointment to the son of the mayor of Glens Falls. And I was the number 1 candidate for the Air Force Academy in 1963 for New York State, and neither one of them gave me the appointment. So I said, look, I'm going to have to become a lawyer and see if I can, help the governmental system run the way it's supposed to. But I figured I'd only have to do that for a few years, and we could fix things up and get things functioning appropriately, and then I could go back and go to the Air Force Academy and become an astronaut. But as I've said a number of times, I discovered that it wasn't that the government was just a little bit out of tune. It turns out that they were actually playing a completely different song than we'd been led to believe. And so I ended up, starting to investigate major things, like the off-the-shelf enterprise and the secret government and the covert operations and the black budget and things like that. But none of that led me back into the issue of UFOs and extraterrestrial intelligence until Marcia Smith asked me to participate in that study. And then later, of course, Dr. John Mack in 1994, and then to be the general counsel for the Disclosure Project in 2001. And then I became part of Dr. John Mack's peer group, the Project for Extraordinary Experience Research at Harvard, because I'd graduated from Harvard College and Harvard Law School, and had done my master's work at Harvard Divinity School and in comparative social ethics. And so I ended up representing Dr. John Mack when the faculty committee hauled him up in front of them and started chastising him for writing his book called Abductions, Human Contact with Extraterrestrials.
I'm glad you
in
brought
1994.
that. I'm really glad you brought that up, because that was one of the major things I want to talk about. We have a break in a little over 10 minutes, so if it carries into the break, then we'll pick it up after. How did you meet John Mack? Because obviously he was a tenured professor at the School of Medicine, Psychiatry, and of course, like you said, he was getting a lot of slack from his peers, which boggled my mind, because you have a medical professional looking at someone who has real symptoms and, of course, concluded that something is really going on. And for them to sort of want to kick him out just blew my mind. Yeah.
Well, how that happened is Robbins. Let me see, Professor Robbins, I think his name was. There was a professor in Santa Barbara. I was teaching at the University of California in Santa Barbara.
My alma mater.
I was teaching a course called The Hidden History of America, the history of CIA covert operations from World War II to the present. Back in 1992, 93, I was teaching there, and Professor Robbins, I think that's Robbins. I think that was his name. Anyway, he was the head of the art department at the Santa Barbara City College, and he and his wife invited Sarah and me to come over to have dinner at their home one Sunday afternoon, and Sarah wasn't able to go, so I was there, and we were getting toward the end of the dinner, and we were having dessert, and he said to me, he said, Danny, do you mind if I ask you a personal question? And I said, no, and he said, what do you think about this issue of extraterrestrial intelligence in this UFO phenomenon? And I said, well, I think it's one of the most important single public policy questions that we have confronting us. And he said, really? He said, how come you've never said anything about it? And I said, you didn't ask me. Nobody ever asked me. And so he said, well, look, he said, my best friend, who was my best friend in the Air Force when I was in the Air Force in Japan, and I was his best man at his wedding, and he's called me up. His name is Dr. John Mack. He is the chairman of the Department of Clinical Psychiatry at Harvard Medical School, and he in fact had been contacted by a number of people to ask him to do workup psychiatric tests for different people who had contact experiences. Like United States Air Force colonels that reported having seen a UFO, and they were sent to get a psychiatric workup, and they sent them to Harvard Medical School to get a psychiatric workup, and Dr. John Mack, as the chairman, had been the guy to do it, and he had done a number of these psychiatric workups, and then because he had learned how to do kind of a protocol on that thing, he had been contacted by Bud Hopkins, and Bud Hopkins had sent a few people to John to do additional checkups on them, and he didn't use hypnosis. He did the holotropic breathing exercises of Stanislav Grof, and because he didn't do any hypnosis, it didn't subject his test to any kind of criticism. And so, but after he'd done a number of these psychological workups, he had gotten really fascinated by this, because he said, look at these people, as far as I can tell, are perfectly normal people, except that they are convinced they've had this experience. And he became fascinated by that whole issue. This is Professor Robbins or whatever they're telling me this, and he says and what happened is that he had decided he was going to write an article for the New England Journal of Medicine about this. What a peculiar phenomenon this is, a psychiatric phenomenon. And so he prepared an article, and he's a Pulitzer Prize winner. He got the Pulitzer Prize for writing the definitive psychobiography of T.E. Lawrence, Lawrence of Arabia, and so he was an accomplished writer. He's the chair of the Department of Clinical Psychiatry at Harvard Medical School, a longtime tenured professor at Harvard. And so he submits this article to the New England Journal of Medicine, and they sent it back to him and said, no, we're not going to publish this. And he was kind of surprised by that. And so he sent them a letter and saying, what's the problem with this? Do you need more footnoting? Do you need more examples of it, more case studies? What is it you need? And they never responded to him. So what he did is he sat down and he went through it and he rewrote the entire article, and he integrated every single potential response to every criticism he could think of. Added in more case studies and got more footnotes and got permission from the people to quote them and everything. And then he resubmitted the article, and within a matter of a few days, the vice president of the assistant editor of the New England Journal of Medicine, comes to his office at Harvard Medical School and walks into his office and hand delivers to him his envelope unopened. He said what was his name, Dr. What's his name, Rawls, or the guy that was the doctor who was the head of, he was the editor-in-chief of the New England Journal of Medicine, had ordered me to return this envelope to you unopened and to tell you that we're not going to publish this article no matter what. And he was really offended by this, and so what he did is he calls up his publisher and said, look, this is what's happened. I'm really upset about this. I want to write a book about this whole phenomenon, and so he did, and it got published, and within a matter of days. Of the publication of his book, Abductions, Human Encounters with Extraterrestrials, the dean of the medical school comes into his office and said, kind of casually sachets into his office and says, oh, John, I heard about your book that you published. Really an interesting subject. I thought I'd kind of like to ask you a few questions about it. As long as we're going to be chatting about it, how would you like to meet with some of the other members of the faculty, and we can chat about this? And John said, "Oh, great. I'm glad. I didn't know whether people were going to be interested in this or not. It's kind of off the beaten path." And so the president of the dean of the medical school said, "Yes, let's get together. Next Thursday afternoon. At 4:00 at such and such a place." And so John went there, expecting to talk with him and a couple of the faculty people, figuring they'd be drinking sherry and having a little discussion. And he walks in, and here is the dean of the medical school sitting up on this dais. Is sitting right next to him is the legal counsel for Harvard University and 4 other members of the faculty, and Dr. What's his name? Starts with an R. Dr. Rawls or something, who was the editor-in-chief of the New England Journal of Medicine.
He was there too.
Yeah, and so they started to excoriate him for what he had done and challenging him, saying, were you charging these people for this work? Did they have insurance? Did you file insurance claims for what you were doing? Did you record what they said? What were the protocols you were following? I mean, they just started excoriating him. So he was completely freaked out, and he kind of withdrew from the whole thing, and he actually called his mother. called his mother,
Poor guy.
and said, "Look at what's happening to me here." And so she sent him to the family lawyer. He was from a fairly wealthy family, pretty well established family in New England, and so he goes to the family lawyer, and the family lawyer listens to him and says, "No, tell them whatever they want. If they want to get copies of the insurance applications, if you filed any, give them to them. The tape recordings of any of the sessions, give them whatever they want." And he was kind of totally shocked. He couldn't believe that. And so he called his friend Robbins, right? He called Professor Robbins, who was his best friend, and told him what was happening to him. And it turns out that the lawyer worked for the law firm that was the attorneys for Harvard University. and so he said, "Isn't there something wrong with that? Shouldn't he have told me that?" And so he's talking to Professor Robbins, and Professor Robbins and he were talking about this, and finally they ended up saying, what about Dan Sheehan? He's done all these big famous cases, and he's a graduate of Harvard College and Harvard Law School, and did his master's work and PhD work at Harvard Divinity School. And do you think he'd be possibly interested in helping me on this thing? And so Professor Robbins asked me about it, and so he said, "Would you be willing to take a call from John?" And I said, "Sure, have him call me." And so John Mack called me and invited me to come back to Cambridge. I was always delighted, always happy to go back to the womb, And so I said, "Sure, I'll come back to Cambridge. We'll sit down and talk about it." And so I ended up representing him, and he and I went and spent a whole weekend with Lawrence Rockefeller, and discussed this. It turns out Rockefeller was extremely interested in this particular subject, as you know, and I didn't know it, but he did, and so we went and sat down with him because his family knew them, and so Lawrence Rockefeller explained to us that his best friend, who was the Prince of Liechtenstein, had actually seen a UFO right on the ground. So Lawrence, that's how Lawrence had gotten really interested in this, because he had no doubt whatsoever that it was true, that his friend was telling him about it. Why would princes of Liechtenstein lie to the Rockefellers?
They wouldn't.
And so he was convinced that it was true, and so he agreed to finance whatever type of a presentation we had to make to the Harvard faculty. We could call all the witnesses. He would finance the whole thing, fly them all in there, put them up, finance any of the exhibits we had to prepare, and also pay for videoing the entire thing. So we were going to prepare to do like a grand rounds to the Harvard faculty, laying out all of the evidence and all the witnesses. It would have been like a major disclosure project like we did in Washington, but this would have been in 1994. And so when we went back to the faculty committee, the next time he was scheduled to go back to see them, I went in with him, and we come in and we sit down. I sit down next to him, and immediately this Dr. John Rawls, or whatever his name was, who I thought appropriately enough was a urologist, starts to piss on him again, and there he is, starting to go after him. So I stood up and I said, "Excuse me, wait a second here." I introduced myself as John's counsel. I said, "Look, let's get something clear here. Exactly what is it we're doing here? What is the nature of this gathering? This certainly isn't an AAUP convened conference, an Association of University Professors conference that has to follow protocols with regard to a tenured professor. Is there some kind of charge that's being made here against him? Is there some sort of threat to his tenure? What's going on here?" And so this Dr. Rawls, whoever his name is, the chairman of the thing, says, what happened is that when Dr. Mack published this book about the UFO stuff, he said the dean of the medical school here started receiving a number of telephone calls from different places and asking him questions about this, and he didn't really know how to answer these things. And so he thought that it would probably be a good idea to ask Dr. Mack about some of these things and get some of this information to enable him to answer these phone calls. And so we decided he was just going to get together with him, and as long as he was going to get together with him, why didn't we just have a few other faculty people participate in this too? I mean, a complete ration of bullshit, basically. And so he lays this out, and I said, "Oh, really?" I said, "Well, then I guess in that spirit, I said, can you tell me who is it that called him?" And there was this big long silence in the room. It went on for like about 15 seconds. And he looks over at the legal counsel for Harvard, and she shakes her head no. And so he said, "Oh, I'm sorry. We're not at liberty to discuss that."
Oh, jeez.
And I said, "Oh, really?" I said, "Well, look, then let me answer this question. If the idea is to give him answers to questions that are being asked I said, what were the questions they were asking?" And there's another big dead silence falls over the room. It goes on for another 10, 15 seconds. Finally, he looks over at the legal counsel from Harvard, and she shakes her head no. And he says, "No, I'm sorry, we're not going to be at liberty to discuss that either." And so I said, "Really?" I said, "This is interesting." So look, let me ask this. Can you tell me whether or not during the course of this proceeding, however you want to characterize it, is it likely that either one or both of either of the two following questions is going to be salient here? Number one, whether or not some other highly intelligent, highly technologically developed sentient civilization exists in our universe. And secondly, whether or not at least one or more of these UFO sightings that have been cited, might reasonably be assumed to be a vehicle from an extraterrestrial civilization. So are either of those questions likely to be pertinent here during the course of this proceeding? And Dr. Rawls says, "Well, they absolutely are, and it's completely ridiculous to think that either one of those things is true." That's what he said. And I said, "Oh, good." I said, "Well, thank you. I'm glad to understand that. So I think I just better tell you that Dr. Mack and I just got through spending the weekend with Lawrence Rockefeller, and he's agreed to finance our presentation for you, and presenting witnesses on these two questions and lots of evidence and data. We have, probably charts and graphs and photographs and videos we'd like to show you. And so we're perfectly prepared to go forward." And the legal counsel for Harvard University leaps to her feet and she says, "Absolutely not. Absolutely not. We're not going to have this proceeding turned into some sort of circus," she says. I said, "Really?" I said, "I wasn't intending to have it be kind of a circus. I just thought we were just going to have like a due process hearing here, and we were allowed to present evidence on these two questions that the chairman here, right on the record, has already acknowledged are pertinent." And she said, "Absolutely not. We're not going to do this." And I said, "Well, excuse me, then I guess we're leaving." And I said, "When you get ready to have a proper hearing on this thing, you just let us know, and we're perfectly prepared to go forward." And so I said, "Come on, John, let's go." And poor John was sitting there frozen, like a deer in the headlights in his chair. And I said, "Come on, John, let's go. We're done." And so I grabbed him by the arm and lifted him up out of his chair, and we turned around and walked out. And so what happened is I ended up retaining local counsel, Eric McLeish, a young lawyer, to be local counsel so we could litigate on the thing if we had to. And within a short period of time, the faculty writes a letter to John apologizing profusely for what they had done. They were very sad that he had misunderstood what the purpose of the whole thing was, and they went on just lying. I mean, it was just absolutely, totally transparent lying. And apologized profusely and agreed to not do anything. There was never any question of tenure or anything of improper conduct, and they apologized profusely and promised to leave him alone. At which point he put together this thing called the Project on Extraordinary Experience Research. And so that over and above the investigation of people who had had this ET experience, or direct contact experience, or even an abduction experience, there were other phenomena which were designated as extraordinary experiences that were metaphysical in nature or parapsychological in nature, And so he undertook to put together this whole group that studied that stuff there at Harvard University. And I became part of it, and I was legal counsel to them. And so I got to sit in on the meetings, and I got to sit in on meetings with people who were experiencers, 8, 10 of the people sit in the circle, and I got to sit there and listen to them and evaluate them for the project. And that's how I became sort of integrated into the process, and ended up being invited to MUFON to brief them on what the proceedings were of what was going on with Dr. Mack and the International UFO Congress, back when Bob Brown ran the thing. And then I got invited to be legal counsel for the Disclosure Project by Dr. Stephen Greer, and I was the legal counsel for the more recent one that Steve Bassett did in Washington. And
Citizen hearing.
So I've been sort of the lawyer for the community, and it had been available to represent anybody who was threatened by having their retirement taken away from them if they were in the government and they revealed this information, and they tried to be prosecuted for somehow violating their security oaths, and so I'm available on a pro bono basis to represent anyone to do that.
Ufology owes you a big sense of gratitude, and we are all grateful for you, for such an asset such as yourself, to be part of it. Mr. Sheehan, we are going for a quick break. When we return, we're going to announce the winners, talk about Contact in the Desert, and pick up, since you're presenting on John Mack, touch on base on that, as well as a few other topics such as Gary McKinnon and the Vatican. Everybody stay tuned. We'll be right back in 3 short minutes. All right. Welcome back to Hour 2 of Dr. J Radio Live. Of course, I am your host, Dr. J, and we've been speaking to a superstar in ufology and one of my big mentors, Daniel Sheehan. Before we pick up where we left off, let's announce the final 3 winners to Contact in the Desert. These are winners number 22, 23, and 24. And by the way, you could see the entire list on my website, drjradiolive.com. The final 3 winners are Annie Palmer, Sheila Keller, and Vicki Lucas. Congratulations, ladies, and we hope to see you there. As you heard, of course, the Contact in the Desert is happening in Joshua Tree Friday, May 29th to Sunday, May 31st, as well as some intensive workshops and lectures Monday, June 1st. Our guest tonight is really busy at that event. I know he's on the disclosure panel with me. He's also talking about the Goldilocks planets and how they can affect disclosure, as well as what we were speaking about, John Mack and the Vatican. And Mr. Sheehan actually wanted to turn it over, rather than spoiling the details that I just gave. I wanted to ask you to go a little more intently on what you're going to present, because I see you're doing 4 things there, at least.
Yes, yeah. I've got on the first day, on Thursday, I'm going to be actually talking about about Pope Francis in his capacity as the first Jesuit Pope, and the fact that the Jesuit order has been calling for, or the Jose Fuentes, who is the Jesuit head of the Papal Observatory, has since October of 2009 been calling upon lay people and theologians and philosophers around the world to start weighing in on and have major discussions about the theological and philosophical implications of contact with an extraterrestrial civilization coming in through the door of these newly discovered planets. The fact that they're with not only the Hubble but the Kepler and the newly launched space satellites, the space telescopes, and the new big telescopes they've now gotten installed down in South America, that they're discovering more and more of these planets, and they're now utilizing that doorway to start talking now about the fact that now that they've actually acknowledged that there are other planets in the universe other than us, that they're now talking about the fact that there are some 20 million Earth-like planets located in the Goldilocks zones, just in our galaxy, and therefore they're starting to talk about more and more how clear it is that there are it's virtually certain that there are other extraterrestrial civilizations that are highly intelligent and highly technologically developed, and that there may be others that even have space travel, superluminal travel, and that's going to be the doorway through which they begin this discussion about what the implications are going to be of the contact. Because as Dr. Fuentes has said, Father Fuentes, he has said that it's now virtually certain that we're going to be discovering in the comparatively near future the existence of other intelligent life, and that we need to start preparing this conversation. So I'm going to be conducting one of those conversations starting on Friday at noontime at the Contact in the Desert, and then I'm going to be at 7 o'clock on the panel on ET and spirituality, again continuing that discussion of philosophy and theology. And then I'm going to be at the meeting with all of the other speakers that evening at 9. And then the following morning on Saturday, I do a major workshop talking about the Dr. John Mack experience and going into great detail about all of this and John's take on the whole thing before he was killed, tragically, that he was preparing a book that no one knows about. That's called The Clash of Worldviews, in which he interpreted what was going on at Harvard with him as a fundamental clash of worldviews. And that he and I were actually in discussions at the time he was killed about establishing, in addition to the peer group at Harvard, an institute for the study of worldviews. I'm going to be discussing that. And then at 7 o'clock that evening on Saturday, there's an additional discussion of UFOs and spirituality at the amphitheater. And then on Sunday morning, I do a full lecture on this issue of the Goldilocks planets and how many of them there are and what this is looking like, and actually discussing this as the doorway into the disclosure. That this is going to be the way that this is feathered into the culture, rather than acknowledging that that they've been in possession of downed UFO craft since at least Roswell in July of '47, and that they've been not only concealing this from everybody, but they've been lying about it and intimidating people and everything, and they're just going to blow right on by that and kind of shift out, and so that the Jesuit order of the Catholic Church is going to attempt to get out ahead of this issue and just kind of reach out and kind of bypass all of the official nation states and start kind of leading the way into this potential disclosure through this other door. And then I have been asked to do one of the intensives on the following Monday, which is a discussion of the whole set of the whole octave of human worldviews as comparative social ethics, and how it is that each of these alternative worldviews affects the actual perception of people of the UFO experience and the ET experience, and discussing with everyone what the comparative impacts of these worldviews are. So that I'll be engaged in, I guess, six different major events, going from Friday at noontime all the way through to the end of the session on Monday.
I'm glad we talked about John Mack, because I just, when that situation happened, when he had his tenure at stake. It really bothered me because a bunch of closed-minded people were willing to kick out one of their best professors and the head of the psychiatry department over a clash of views. And so I'm really excited to hear about the new book and that presentation, plus to get some more details. With the Vatican, I want to ask you this. They seem to me more than any other religion to be paving the way to disclosure. First, by having the statement that they would baptize an alien. Then the other statement where they changed the word from world to universe to encompass everything. And then, of course, the other statement, which basically said Jesus died on the cross for man, that doesn't necessarily have to apply to the sins of our space brothers. And I thought that was all really fascinating because you don't hear any other major religion doing this.
No, it's the Jesuits that are doing it. You need to understand that there's this extraordinary thing going on inside the Catholic Church right now, and that it's not at all coincidental that Francis, who is doing all of these extraordinary things, as you know, in shocking the world over what he's doing, is the first Jesuit pope in the entire history of the Church. And he is demonstrating to the world the difference between the Jesuit order, the Society of Jesus, the largest single order in the Catholic Church, and the Vatican, historically. That the Jesuits are the only one of all of the Catholic orders that is not subject to the authority of the Vatican, and that it's completely independent, and it's done a complete revision of the Society of Jesus since Pedro Arrupe became the Superior General back in 1962. It's a fascinating story, and I'm going to be talking about this at the Contact in the Desert for people to understand what it is that's going on. The Jesuits, it's not coincidental that Father Fuentes is the head of the Vatican Library. It's not coincidental that it's a Jesuit, the head of the library. The Jesuits are the head of the diplomacy now for the Church. There's a couple books that Malachi Martin has written, one of the very conservative Jesuits, where he was concerned that the Jesuits were going to eventually take over the entire Catholic Church and transform it from its reactionary kind of proto-fascist, authoritarian, misogynist kind of history that it's had. Of the Crusades and the Inquisition and all that, and transform it into a major force for social justice and progressive modifications of the religious vision for our human family to prepare us for the new age of extraterrestrial life and interplanetary space travel.
Speaking of disclosure, you've clearly been involved with many high-profile cases we were discussing earlier. The Iran-Contra case, just that alone is a very, very major case. But you've had access to so many things. Of course, being involved with John Mack, being the counsel to the Disclosure Project, Dr. Greer, as well as the more recent citizen hearing. I wanted to ask you this. I fear that the alien craft and artifacts are probably sitting, and this is just speculation, I want to ask you what you think about it, are possibly, whichever you want to say, sitting in the hands of private corporations. That way they don't have to answer to anyone within the government, and more importantly, they don't have to answer to FOIA requests. Do you think that's plausible?
Well, as I said at the top of the show, is that I don't get paid to guess.
That's right. That's right.
Yes. The fact is, you don't have that. I'm in those positions where you don't have to guess at things. That if people want to know badly enough, I can find out. But it takes a professional process by means of which you do this. If people are willing to put together, like for example, if every one of your listeners were to contribute $10 to you, to if you have a 501c3 or something, and put it together and say, look, you wanted to get that question answered professionally, we could do it. That's the kind of different perspective that I bring to the entire UFO community, is that that everybody can speculate, and then one person can get upset because they have a speculation that's different than another person's speculation, and they argue with each other, and and they're arguing half about facts and half about speculation, and it's unfortunate for the community. And so what I'm saying is, look, that I think that we ought to have a serious discussion of a number of these things, identify some very specific factual questions that we want answered, put together our resources in a way that supports a professional investigation. I do the whole thing for free myself, but as I say, that you need to pay professional investigators and experts and stuff to evaluate these things, and the photography and the scientific. Like, for example, when we're the ones that did the thing with General Ramey's telegram.
I didn't know you were responsible for deciphering that.
Yeah, that was us. That I was out at the International UFO Congress back in, I guess, it was 96 or something, and was talking about what the latest was on the John Mack stuff that we were doing, and a fellow came up out of the audience and said that he wanted to talk to me, and it turns out that he had located the photographer who took the photograph, the famous photograph of Jesse Marcel and Ramey, kneeling there in front of the purported, weather balloon debris, and we noticed that Ramey had this telegram of some kind in his hand, and I'd noticed it before. And when this guy started talking to me about the fact that he'd found this photographer, I said, "Whoa, now this is really far out. Let's see if."
Okay, we are back. We lost Mr. Sheehan. Let's go bring him right back. There was a little technical glitch here. Mr. Sheehan, I seem we have lost you there, right?
No, that's right. It was just for a second.
Yeah.
For a second. Yeah, and so that's the kind of model of how you can do it. And and I've been in charge of all kinds of technical investigations and professional investigations, and so we know how to do this thing. And so that what I think we need to do is we need to professionalize, just like John Rao has been doing. John Rao has substantially professionalized the entire International UFO Congress. You've seen how that's done with Open Minds magazine and the radio and the television. It's all very professional now, and that we have to step up into the next generation of UFO studies. And so that's what I think we should do. And so with regard to your question, so I refrain from speculating about these things because I'm one of the people in the world that might very likely be retained to study it. And so I don't like to bias my position on something just by guessing. But the reality of it is based on the evidence that we have so far, it's quite clear that there are examples of this having been done, of various types of national security activities being basically licensed out to private companies, not just the building of some of our most highly sensitive national security technology, from computers to jet aircraft and everything, are all contracted out to private companies. And we know from the discussions of the Majestic 12 that there's a very specific set of evidence and data around suggesting that the people that were brought in to oversee this entire subject by President Truman were made up of people that come and go in and out of the government and spend a substantial portion of their time outside of the government as part of a decision-making community that is not subject to oversight and not subject to, as you point out, discovery through the Freedom of Information Act. And so that it is not an unrealistic set of assumptions that you're making, but they just need to be investigated and ascertain, exactly who is it that's in charge of all this stuff.
This is exactly why I say you're such an asset to the community, because you go with it with facts in the lawyer-like mind that you have. You use strictly facts, and I'm really glad that you said that in the beginning of the show, which you just again repeated, that you don't speculate, because that's one of the great things that doesn't help us. It's okay to speculate an idea, but it's not
Mhm.
okay to go off on that speculation as quasi fact. Now
No, that's right.
I'm going to
Yeah.
change gears to a topic that's been extremely important to me, and I know you were involved. You gave a fascinating lecture on this, and that is Gary McKinnon. And I was wondering if you want to tell the background story of what landed him in some heat, or do you want me to tell that quick? You
You
know
go ahead.
knowledge.
You
Well,
go ahead and do it.
well, essentially, a hacker from the UK, a purported hacker, was looking for UFO evidence and hacked into the NASA database and found a list of non terrestrial officers as well as non terrestrial ships. And he was facing, I believe, 70 years, and they were trying to extradite him to the US from the UK. And it took a 10-year battle, which fortunately the extradition was blocked. The reasoning I understood was that we use reasonable suspicion to extradite people, whereas in order to extradite out of the U.S. to the U.K., they need probable cause, a much higher standard, and hence there were 10 times more the rate of people being extradited out of the U.K. to the U.S. than out of the U.S. to the U.K. Was that everything in a nutshell? Would you say?
Yeah, yeah, that's right. This entire area of treaty relationships and extradition is a kind of a highly technical area in dealing with the law, and it all comes down to being pretty political. And the UK and the United States, of course, are sort of clear partners. They're major strategic partners in the world, and have been ever since the founding of the country. So that the hand in glove relationship between the UK and for example, in 1922, at the end of World War One, the commission that was put together by the UK under the supervision of, at that time, Winston Churchill in 1922, who was the Secretary for Colonial Affairs, is the commission that actually set up the boundaries for all of the nation states, all through the Middle East. Because it had been previously the Turkish Empire, the Ottoman Empire, previously the Persian Empire, and that they were aboriginal tribes. It was a tribal territory, most of those areas, and they superimposed a whole set of nation-state boundaries over them and assigned, different members of the Allies from World War One to be the caretakers for those areas, primarily to develop the oil. And in the U.S., stood astride that entire operation. And even though England had been basically in World War II pounded into the ground by the Blitzkrieg, and France had been basically invaded and occupied by Germany, and in the other allies, the United States stood astride of the whole world. But the United States kind of step by step, assisted those colonial powers in still exercising control over a lot of their former colonies, such as France and Vietnam and Southeast Asia, etc. So that the special relationship that the U.S. has with the UK would normally lead one to believe that the UK would immediately extradite anybody that they wanted. But as you've seen with Julian Assange, that since Julian Assange, who is the big WikiLeaks guy, that he's ensconced himself in the Ecuadorian embassy in London, and the London officials will not do anything to put him back into the U.S. So there are limits on what it is they're willing to do. So that whole issue of why it is that the U.S. has been unable to successfully get at him is a fascinating story.
I thought so too, especially for the fact that they took it so seriously. If it was just hokey pokey, that some 30-year-old 34-year-old, if I'm not mistaken, at the time when he discovered these in the UK, came across under NASA non-terrestrial officers. I would have thought the official government response would have been to sort of blow him off, because by trying to prosecute the guy, they really added credence to the story and made it literally world news.
I know. Yeah, you would have figured they would have been a little smarter than that.
Exactly. I have some written questions here that I've received from across the random places. Okay, this is from David Horn in Houston, Texas. Has Daniel Sheehan thought of any legal avenues to use to pry open the federal government storehouses of information about UFOs?
Well, it's interesting. I don't speculate on that. What I do is if people are interested adequately in getting it done, it's just like any other thing, that I get approached by a set of clients who have the adequate resources to do something, and then I start directing my attention to the kind of research that would be necessary to figure out what the various levels of efficacy might be to do that. But most of the time, most of the time I can find out that kind of information without having to try to go through the front door, because they've got the front doors guarded, and so you go in through the kitchen window. I've got Class A licensed professional investigators, that work with me, that are former Air Force intelligence, that are former military intelligence, they're former intelligence officers all around, both foreign and domestic, and they have all kinds of sources that can find things out. And so I, in a sense, in addition to being a professional litigator, both at the trial level and appellate levels, all the way to the Supreme Court, also basically run professional investigators. And so that's how you combine all of those different resources, and you can find out basically anything, that there's an adequate clientele that want that done. So that again, it's a measure of the degree of seriousness of a group of people as to how badly they really want something done. Otherwise, it's just a whole bunch of people speculating and saying, "Hey, why don't you go do this?" Or wouldn't it be fun to do that? I can guarantee you, you don't get very far down the line with something like that before you're left standing there, alone. And so you need to have an adequately serious coalition of people who are willing to devote the kind of time and resources to something to make it follow through before you venture down that road. And I'm willing to go down the road, as I've demonstrated many times on many important cases, but it's always because there's an adequate degree of seriousness shown. And so rather than just do something kind of as a hoot, I'm prepared to do things professionally. For example, I was approached by the people who run Live Aid, that big annual concert that they do to generate Live Aid, and they were interested in whether or not I'd be interested in supervising a professional investigation of 9/11. And they asked, what did I think happened during 9/11? And I said the same thing to them. I don't get paid to think.
You get paid to investigate.
Actually, I don't get paid at all. But the putting together of a solid professional investigative team with the kind of experts that you need to have on board to make something work is what I specialize in doing. I can do that. I know what the budget would look like and who the people are, the kind of different personnel I would need. Who's your Mission Impossible team that you'd want to have to get that thing done. And that's the service that I provide. It's the pro bono service that I provide to actually put the team together and lead it.
The other question is also a speculation question, so I'm going to avoid that one.
Okay.
This other one is from Mark Huber in Tennessee. Has Mr. Sheehan submitted any FOIA requests recently relating to UFOs?
No.
Now, this is my own personal question. Have you submitted any FOIA requests in your tenure?
Nope. No. That Richard Dolan does most of that. Now, Richard just is. He's kind of got that field covered. and he does it and devotes the kind of time and energy to it.
Now, going back to the different panels that we're going to give, that the 6 different things that you're involved in at Contact in the Desert, I want to go back to the Vatican. And it seems to me that, first of all, there's been a lot of shakeup in there. We had Pope Benedict require, then then I hear Pope Francis doesn't even want to finish his tenure; that he wants to retire.
That's what he's going to do is he's been planning since the beginning that there's a whole series of things that he's getting ready to do. That he is, for example, on June 5th, is going to be issuing a papal encyclical on the global climate change and transnational corporate capitalism, and pointing out that the proximate causation of the massive global climate change is in fact the immoral and unethical economic system on the planet, and that radical steps need to be taken to transform that. He is, in fact, made an official request to appear before the General Assembly of the United Nations in September, the first ever for a Pope. He has sought permission and has now obtained permission to do an address to the joint House and Senate of the United States in September. And then he is standing by to deliver a major presentation on December 8th. And you need to understand that the June 5th date of his papal encyclical is on World Environment Day, and the December 8th date is important because the Paris gathering of the nation states to determine whether or not the major nation states are going to be subjected to a legally binding and enforceable set of constraints on the global greenhouse gas emissions if they do not, in fact, submit to such a regime of mandatory and enforceable, legally enforceable restrictions on their global greenhouse gas emissions. He is going to, on December 8th, be issuing the call for a Jubilee year to cancel all of the debts on the planet. And leave the banks holding the bag on that, and so he has already indicated that he's going to be devoting his entire administration to getting all of those things done if necessary, and he's not going to allow himself to be compromised by saying, oh, he can't spend all of his political capital of his entire papacy, in just a 5-year period on something of that importance, because he's got 20 years to have to spread out and do things. He's not going to make that. He's not going to do that thing. He's not going to say, I'm not going to, risk my power and reputation, all of that, because I have to husband it over a 20-year period. He's going to let the whole thing go, and tell them that he's. In fact, if he's compelled by the failure of the nation states to join adequately in a compulsory system of restraints, and he's compelled to issue the Jubilee year call on December 8th, that the reality of it is that he is going to expend all of his political capital. And he's not going to allow himself to be subjected to the Vatican's effort to recall him, to challenge him, to remove him from office or anything, because he will call the Jubilee year in the name of Saint Celestine. And Saint Celestine is the only other pope. When they were talking about Benedict, who got forced out because he was right in the crosshairs of having protected all of those pedophiles in the church, and he got caught doing it, and so they've ousted him and locked him up basically in a convent there on the Vatican grounds, where he is going to be kept there. The bottom line is that if Francis is compelled to call for the Jubilee year, the cancellation of the debts, he's doing so in the name of Saint Celestine, because Celestine is the only other pope in history who voluntarily retired. and it was back in, I think, 1233. He was a monk, a hermit monk. He lived up in a cave up in the mountains outside of Rome, and when the conclave chose him to be pope, they sent a team up to notify him to go up into the mountains to find him. And when he saw them coming, he ran away. He didn't want to be pope. And so they dragged him down. They had him be pope. And after about 4 or 5 months, he said, this is really inconsistent with my spiritual life. And he retired. And so so Francis, if compelled to call for the Jubilee year, the Jubilee, of course, is the old practice in the Jewish tradition of every 5 years, every sixth year having a Jubilee year in which they canceled all of the debts, which was to keep usurious activities from basically imprisoning people in their debt. That you can't allow a debt to stand for more than 5 years. That was considered usury. And so what he's going to do is, if he's compelled to do it, he'll call for the Jubilee year in the name of Constantine, or excuse me, of Celestine, and thereby at the same time be issuing the message that he's going to be retiring. And the fact is that we know already. I know, as the former chief counsel of the judges, I know already who the other pope's going to be when he does it. And I can tell you, it ain't going to get better for the bad guys.
In your tenure, I've obviously working with the Vatican and with what you've been doing with the Jesuit Society. Forgive me for messing up that name. Did you ever come across Monsignor Balducci?
Oh, sure. Balducci was an important kind of a precursor for all of this stuff. Yeah, but I knew him. Well, I met him a couple times. But he was actually given sort of the green light to kind of do some of the forward scouting on some of these things, and it was kind of an informal thing. But he was given the blessing to go ahead and start feeling this thing out. But now you've got Fuentes, full blown head of the Vatican Observatory, making official, full-scale public statements, out of the Vatican on this subject. It's much different now. It's an entire octave above what he was doing.
I heard every time he was on that the Pope, regardless of what he was doing, asked to watch him on TV, or if it was a radio show, listen to him. Did you ever get that feedback from him?
Well, they've been monitoring very closely what he was doing and what he was saying, because they viewed this entire thing as being so important to kind of get this thing into a position to make their full-scale decision as to what they were going to do about this. That the Society of Jesus under Pedro Arrupe, who was the Superior General, had been advocating that this program be undertaken and to get out ahead of this thing. And the Vatican was resisting and holding back and testing the waters and trying to see, if this was going to work or not. And so that there was this process that unfolded. And so I'm sure that John Paul II, was very interested in watching this thing. Paul VI was a little bit taken up with the Vatican Bank things. He was involved in the administration of Pius XII in that entire type of bank scandal that went down, with the Banco Ambrosiano, with Cardinal Marcinkus and in that crowd.
We have a little under 10 minutes left, and I know we can go on several more of these topics, but I want to ask you, do you have any other lectures coming up after Contact in the Desert? And are you working on any cases as a professional investigator regarding ufology right now?
No, I've got the third book that I've been contracted to write. I'm doing the second book now. I've got the initial book out, which was called The People's Advocate, which is out now, Counterpoint Press out of Berkeley. I'm doing the second book now that is called Rulers of the Realm, talking about the secret government and the power behind the official institutions. and I'm going to be doing a third book, which is basically the dream fulfilled, articulating the establishment of a new paradigm institute and the effectuation of major public policy changes pursuant to the natural law worldview. That's the sixth paradigm worldview in the octave of worldviews that I'll be talking about at the Contact in the Desert. But the eighth paradigm is the post-contact worldview, the real full-scale new paradigm worldview that we're exploring right now, and that's going to be the subject of the third book.
You wrote about the secret government, and in the first hour, you were talking about the fact that you acknowledge them. How did you come across that our elected officials are not really the ones that are calling the shots for the major?
When you find a president shot down on the streets of Dallas, and the people that are assigned to do the investigation in the Warren Commission constitute Alan Dulles, whom he had fired as the head of the Central Intelligence Agency, and Gerald Ford, who later was brought on to be the vice president under Nixon to pardon him. And you understand that Alan Dulles was the attorney for Brown Brothers Harriman and a senior partner in the law firm of Sullivan and Cromwell, and that his grandfather, John W. Foster, was the Secretary of State for Benjamin Harriman back in 1893, that oversaw the seizure, basically, of Hawaii and the Philippines and Guam, and instigated the Spanish-American War to take over Cuba, etc. And these are all people functioning out of Brown Brothers Harriman and Sullivan and Cromwell. You discover it isn't terribly hard once you really start doing a full-scale professional investigation of tracking all these people back to find out where this is coming from. And the CEO for Brown Brothers Harriman was George Herbert Walker, the grandfather of George H.W.
That
Bush.
I didn't know. I really.
Oh yeah.
Interesting. He
set up the Union Bank of New York in 1924. It's got a branch office in the Netherlands that was the Bank of Credit, Bank of Shipping and Commerce, that actually funded the construction of the national headquarters for the fascist party in Germany, Hitler. They're the ones that funded the rise of the Nazi government to establish them as the bulwark against Bolshevism in Europe. And it was funded right straight out of the Union Bank of New York by George Herbert Walker. It takes time to dig these things out and research these things and find them all. But once you start to put the pieces together, you can see what is there.
You've done so much in your life, going back, like I said, to the Iran-Contra, to getting funding to SETI, representing Dr. Mack, the Disclosure Project, the Citizen Hearing, of course, digging in and realizing that the Bush family is involved with funding the Nazis, and so much. What to you was the most startling thing you've uncovered in your entire tenure of investigating our government and UFOs?
Well, I think probably the most revealing single thing, it was actually when I was at Harvard University. I had Henry Kissinger for foreign policy, and had worked in Bobby Kennedy's campaign back in '68, because two of my professors, one was going to be his Secretary of State and one was going to be his Secretary of the Defense Department. And I had gone up to the law school in '68. I graduated from Harvard College in '67. And on December 18th, as I recall, of 1967, I received notice that the Professor Crane Brinton, who was the chairman, a 30-year chairman of the Department of Intellectual History at Harvard University, was going to be delivering his final lecture down at Harvard at the undergraduate school. And he had been asked to lecture on, in his final lecture, what the single most important intellectual insight of our human family was that he had encountered in 50 years of his research. And so I went down to be there for the lecture. They had to move it from the room where he was going to be lecturing to Lowell Hall, Lowell Hall, to get everybody in there, because kids came back from who had him over the past 30 years to be there for his final lecture. And he got up in front of everybody, and he said, look, he said, I've been asked to address the question here in my final lecture as to what the single most important intellectual insight is that our human family has come to in all the time that I've been researching. And he said, that this is an easy answer for me. He said, I believe that the greatest minds in our human family have basically all come to realize that our human family is on the very brink of the very next step in our biological evolution, and that the new faculty that we are evolving will distinguish us as Homo sapien in the new species that is going to be evolving, will be as different from Homo sapien as Homo sapien is from Homo erectus. And he said, and that this new faculty is going to be a faculty much like seeing or hearing. But this faculty is going to be able to directly and immediately experientially discern the unitive phenomenon that bonds every single ultimately irreducible integer of matter in the entire physical universe into one harmonious whole. And that by this experience, by dint of this experience like seeing or hearing, each individual human being will be able to directly and experientially discern what form of human conduct, individual or collective, is either harmonious with or disharmonious to the natural order of the universe.
Wow.
And then he said, and I think that's why so many of you young men in this generation are refusing to go and fight in this unjust war in Vietnam.
I would have been a truly fascinating lecture to have been at, and I can imagine why so many people from 3 decades prior to came to see that. And It was a very unjust war. We got just literally 2 minutes left. I do have one final question from a listener. I'm going to go ahead and ask it, but if we can get it as quick as possible.
Yeah.
Are the factual conclusions of the Warren Commission correct? And if not, what are incorrect?
They're totally incorrect, and knowingly incorrect, intentionally incorrect. You know, that President Kennedy was assassinated by the S-Force that was in fact put together at the request of Richard Nixon back in July of 1960 in a phone call that he placed in a classified phone call to Howard Hughes, who was working as a special consultant to the National Security Council at that time, which Richard Nixon, as the vice president under Eisenhower, chaired the 5412 committee of that for covert operations, and Nixon had Howard Hughes, through his lawyer Bob Mayhew, put together an assassination team made up of Miami-based Cubans to kill Fidel Castro and Raul Castro and Che Guevara and the 5 other new commandantes in the revolutionary government. And that is the team that killed the president.
So it clearly went all the way to the top. Mr. Sheehan, we are out of time. I wanted to give you one opportunity before the music comes on to tell everybody where they can find you, a website, and where they can get your books.
Sure. They can reach me at the Romero Institute. It's romeroinstitute.com, and it's on the internet. They can reach me through danielpsheehan.org. But if they go to the Romero Institute on the internet, romeroinstitute.org, they can find all the major projects we're engaged in. They can find the contact information for us, and they can purchase a copy of the book, The People's Advocate, and get any of our other materials, finding out about our projects up in representing the 9 Dakota reservations in South Dakota, or other projects we're working on now.
Excellent. Thank you so much. It's been such a fascinating interview. Everybody out there, be sure and check us out at Contact in the Desert. This is Dr. J signing out.